Greetings, friends. I'm Jim Fleming, editor and publisher at a radical book publishing house in Brooklyn, New York called Autonomedia. And I'm joined by Ron Sakolsky, the author of a new Autonomedia book of about 630 pages called Dreams of Anarchy and the Anarchy of Dreams. Ron is joining us from his home in Denman Island, a small island off the coast, the east coast of Vancouver Island in British Columbia, Canada. Hello, Ron.
Hey, Jim.
Ron's book, Dreams of Anarchy and the Anarchy of Dreams, is on the relation of anarchism to surrealism. And we are going to record this session for the New York Art Book Fair, which is happening virtually this year because of COVID. It will be available there, and then perhaps eventually you might find it on YouTube if you are not attending the book fair. So, Ron, how did you get involved in this large book project? What was the impetus for your taking it on?
Well, I mean, the impetus for this project, which is now a long-term project, really goes back to the publication of Surrealist Subversions, which was an Autonomedia anthology that was focused on the Chicago Surrealist group. And I did that in 2002. And when I did that, as I said, the focus was relatively narrow on this one particular group, even within the United States, just focusing on the Chicago folks. And I decided, I started thinking about the idea that maybe we could do something broader, something that would connect surrealism and anarchy beyond just Chicago, beyond just the United States, put it in an international kind of context to it. And do that maybe in conjunction with the upcoming 100th anniversary of the beginnings of surrealism, which would have been back in 1924. So I think we're coming along with the book. I think we should have it before then. No, actually, it should be out anytime soon.
Yeah, I think probably this month.
Yes, let's say this month. And so basically, in doing that, I've been thinking about this book for 20 years, but I've actually been working on it in a concerted way, writing, doing the writing and the research over the last 6 years. So the conceptualization process has reached fruition at this point, and we're ready to roll with this. And really there's a shortage of books on the politics of surrealism. Most books are about surrealism as an art form. And most of the books about the politics of surrealism really focus on Marxism or Trotskyism, or those connections that have been there in surrealism, that are currents that have connected with surrealism and intersected with them, with each other over the years. So I thought, well, what if we had an anarchist lens to the 100-year history of surrealism? What if we could really make that our analytical focus? And in that sense, really the book is an anarcho-surrealist kind of way of understanding the history of surrealism and the way in which surrealists have seen themselves politically.
The Trotskyist connection, I suppose, is largely through the personal affiliation of Breton with Trotsky. But you argue in the book that that's actually much briefer and fraught than a deeper, longer connection with anarchist currents.
Yeah, I mean, basically, what I'm trying to do in the book is I'm not trying to say there are no connections between surrealism and Marxism or Trotskyism, and that the only ones that count are with anarchism. But what I'm wanting to do is make those anarchist connections clear, because they've been obfuscated historically, and they've been disappeared and thought of as an afterthought, if anything. And so I wanted to focus more on that aspect to it. So even if we look at Trotsky and look at the surrealist connections to Trotsky, going back particularly to the Mexican Manifesto of 1938, which is when Breton and Trotsky met in Mexico at the house of Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo. And I think most people know of that connection by seeing the Frida Kahlo movie. But that connection ended up in producing the Mexican Manifesto, which is a manifesto that was signed by both Breton and by Diego Rivera, but not by Trotsky. Trotsky didn't sign it because he was in exile in Mexico at the time, and he was not allowed to do anything political during that time. So even though it was formulated primarily, almost exclusively between Breton and Trotsky, it was signed by Diego Rivera on Trotsky's behalf. And in that manifesto, one of the attractions for Breton was the idea that what was being promised in that manifesto was an anarchist regime of individual liberty. That's a quote. Those words were a quote. And he was very much wanting to see Marxists commit to the idea of intellectual and artistic freedom and that kind of thing. Trotsky at that moment, in his life, he was on the ropes politically, of course. He had been ousted by the Stalinists, and eventually, as we know, he was assassinated in Mexico at the behest of Stalin. So he was looking for allies and friends, and he was willing to make that concession, in a way, if you will, to Breton, provided that Breton allowed the political end of things in terms of the organization of the government to happen under his regime, a regime that would be a Trotskyist regime. Now, there's a major contradiction in all that, of course, when you talk about anarchy and government. But I think Breton was hoping that this would at least be a model for how things could be and weren't, based on his own brief association with the Communist Party, which eventually was an association with Stalinism that he had no interest in. But as Stalin came to power in the Soviet Union, ideas like socialist realism, which are the antithesis of surrealism, were the ones that came to the fore. And Breton found that he had absolutely no voice in intellectual, artistic, cultural matters. And he was hoping that he and the surrealists would have that kind of a voice, not that it would be exclusively their domain, but they would have an influence in that regard. That never materialized. So with Trotsky, he thought, well, here's a chance where perhaps I could at least move in that direction and show that it's possible to link the two. And of course, it wasn't. Trotsky was assassinated before anything could happen. It's probably doubtful whether it ever would have happened, even if Trotsky would have lived and come to power, which was a big if, right?
Yeah, Trotsky also
very unlikely.
had a solid relationship with anarchism before as well. The Kronstadt.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And Breton eventually was able to point that out and say Trotsky's actions in the Kronstadt uprising in the early days of the Soviet Union, where Trotsky was in charge of the Red Army and moved in and basically, murdered these rebellious Kronstadt sailors who were basically rebellious in the sense that they were wanting to hold the Soviet Union to its promises of Soviets that would be workers' councils controlled by the workers.
Yeah.
The Stalin, not Stalin, but Lenin and Trotsky wanted none of that.
Yeah.
And the decision was made to move against the Kronstadt workers, the sailors of Kronstadt. And they were mercilessly put down. So for Breton, that is something he ended up calling an indelible stain that led him eventually to reignite his interest in anarchy, which had always been there for the Surrealists. And eventually he became, a few years later, involved in the Anarchist Federation in France, working in conjunction with them.
Yeah. Well, a few of the Surrealists had different paths. There were a couple prominent Surrealists who actually ended up having some long relationship with Stalinism. And perhaps the most popular, in a mean sense, of the Surrealist painters, Dali, had soft spot for fascism. Do you say something about those tendencies in Surrealism?
Yeah, well, I mean, when the Surrealists, the Paris Surrealist group, a number of those group participants decided to join the Communist Party in 1927, I believe it was. They joined with the idea that they could have some impact. And Breton realized a few years later that that was not going to be the case. And he and several others, Benjamin Perret, people like that, decided to leave the Communist Party. So they didn't have a very long relationship with the party itself. But others who had joined back in 1927, people like Aragon, decided that no, that they would stay and see what they could do within the confines of the party. And as the party became more and more Stalinist, people like Aragon were more and more caught up in that kind of framework and never really left. They stuck with it. Now, people like Dali, who was eventually told by the Paris Surrealist group that he was not welcome to participate with them anymore, was told that even though he was one of the most popular Surrealists in terms of name recognition, people know him, worldwide, and often Surrealism is associated with his name more than any other. The Surrealists felt that in spite of that, and in spite of his original contributions to Surrealism in the early days, which were very significant in terms of the material that he was doing and the approach that he took, they decided that they no longer would want an association with him based on his support for Franco. Mm-hmm. At some point, in the Spanish Revolution, he was neutral. He didn't take sides. And when Franco came to power, he established a relationship with Franco, which included painting portraits of, I think it was Franco's niece, and generally having a relationship with Franco that was detested by the other Surrealists who wanted nothing to do with fascism.
Yeah.
And so they eventually wanted nothing to do with Dali because he was refusing to condemn fascism, and not only refusing to condemn it, but sort of winking at it in a way that they found unacceptable.
Yeah. Well, some of the other Surrealists, including a number of French Surrealists like Perret, were quite involved in the Spanish Civil War.
Yeah, Perret actually fought in the Spanish Civil War. At first, he was involved with an organization called POUM, P-O-U-M, which was the same organization that George Orwell was involved with. And a lot of people know Homage to Catalonia, the book that Orwell did about his experience in the Spanish Civil War with the Spanish Revolution, which was an anarchist revolution. Perret was also involved with that same group. The group was primarily made up of anti-Stalinists. So many people in the United States, when they think of the people who went to Spain to fight against the fascists, who were not Spanish themselves, think of the international brigades. And the international brigades were really under the auspices of the Communist Party. But people who didn't want to support the Stalinist Communist Party, but still did want to support the Spanish Revolution, which was largely anarchist, found other means to come to Spain and to get involved. And the POUM was one of those groups, which had mostly anarchists and Trotskyists, probably predominantly had a Trotskyist flavor to it, but welcomed anarchists. And Perret eventually found the POUM to be even too narrow for him. They weren't Stalinists, they were anti-Stalinist, but they ended up supporting the Spanish people who were fighting on the side of the Republicans in their agreement to go into a government, which is very contrary to what most anarchists find appropriate. But these were anarchists who were going into a government and working with people who were communists, who were Stalinists, basically. And so he wanted none of that, and he left the POUM because they were willing to support that, and joined up with Durruti and the anarchist militia. So he was very, very militant in terms of his support for anarchism in Spain. He would write to Breton, keep him informed, tell him what was going on. And, you know, it was something that Breton on his end was part of the Committee for Free Spain. And so he was very involved in supporting the revolution without actually being present there himself.
Yeah. Well, let's go back to the origins of Surrealist movement and try to identify some anarchist influences on it from that point in time. What were the anarchist precursors of Surrealism, the influential ones?
Yeah, I'd like to do that in a moment, but I realized there's one thing I needed to mention about Spain. If we can just bounce back to Spain for a moment.
Yeah.
I think that it's important to realize that it wasn't just this sort of a rational, you know, thing that, or a strictly ideological thing that happens between anarchists and Stalinists that was driving the scenario that I talked about earlier. The Communist Party was actively involved in subverting the anarchists because they saw anarchy as a threat to their hegemony as the revolutionary movement that people should follow in the world. And so they did, it wasn't just the fascists that were a threat to the anarchists in Spain, but also the Communist Party, the Stalinists.
Yeah.
So, but if we go to a much earlier kind of arrangement, I think we're talking about, I don't know how far back you want to go, but if you're looking for earlier places in which that kind of situation was happening, we can go to Breton's essay, which is The Black Mirror of Anarchy. And that's an essay that appeared in one of my favorite Autonomedia books called Drunken Boat. And in that essay, he takes a radical romanticist point of view, the editor of that book, Max Bleckmann. And Breton is really talking about his roots in anarchy. He sees himself initially in the Black Mirror of Anarchy. That's his initial political connection. And it's one that he maintains to varying degrees throughout his life. And eventually at the end of his life becomes much more involved with, but he never completely discards it. So some of the earlier predecessors of that, you know, we could look back to the illegalists, who, you know, did things like rob banks, the Bonneau gang, or the burglars who were called the night workers. Those people both had the people involved with those groups both had the strong anarchist connections. There was also the individualist anarchist connection, going back to Max Stirner. There's a connection to, let's see, there's the aesthetic anarchists, you know, the symbolists back to the sort of literary and artistic, you know, roots. All of those things were influential on Breton, as was the propagandists of the deed, the people who were planting bombs with the idea that, you know, we could shake things up to the point that people would have to address, you know, the social questions that were not being dealt with under parliamentary systems, and all of those had their influence.
Felix Fénéon was an influence on Breton.
Who?
Felix Fénéon?
Yes, Felix Fénéon for sure. And he was, in fact, people were not only thinking of him as an art critic, which he was, but he was very much an anarchist and part of this milieu, and was involved in planting a bomb himself. I know that for many years people wondered whether that was true or not, but information was finally discovered in which he actually admits that he was involved in some of that propaganda of the deed work himself. But I guess the biggest connection that people make in terms of the pre-surrealist milieu is Dada. So when we think of Dada, there was a Paris Dada group of which Breton and a number of people who were going to become part of the Paris Surrealist group were a part. And so they, it was Breton who invited Tristan Tzara to come to Paris. There were people who were part of Dada that were involved in the Paris Surrealist group, and that certainly was an influence as well. And eventually, Breton decided there were things about the Dada group that he liked, but other things that he felt were too negative, and he wanted to be more constructive, and he wanted to leave the art world milieu and do something that would have an impact historically outside of the framework of the art world. And he felt he needed to leave Dada, and a number of the surrealists felt they needed to leave Dada for that reason. Yeah. And then the founding of Surrealism happens in 1924. Yeah.
So Dada is not generally thought of as primarily French, but there were surrealist movements outside of France as well, significant movements in Czechoslovakia and Poland and Egypt. Can you say something about some of these other places?
Yeah, I mean, Surrealism has always been an international movement. And one of the things that I wanted to do in the book is to decenter Surrealism so that it isn't exclusively thought of as a Parisian kind of thing, or even just a Francophone thing. If we're talking about Czechoslovakia, a very significant Surrealist group has existed in Czechoslovakia and now Czech Republic for many years. And so in the year 1968, before May 68 happened in Paris, a number of Parisian surrealists went to Czechoslovakia in those days and met with the Prague group, the Prague Surrealist group, and formulated the Platform of Prague, which is a very important document, and in a way anticipates May 68 that would erupt shortly thereafter in Paris, a few weeks later. Of course, the Czechoslovakian group had a lot to contend with because Czechoslovakia was under the occupation of the Soviet Union. And so this was during the Prague Spring when the Prague Platform came out, when it seemed like there might be possibilities for a more openness to, and a more of a liberalization, at least, of what had previously been a very authoritarian regime. And as that started to unfold, the Soviet Union sent troops in and put it down. And so if you look at the Prague group continuing to survive underground for all those years and up till today is still involved in surrealism, and very significantly. Probably the best known member of that group is Jan Sfunkmeyer, the filmmaker, does these amazing animations, as well as the films that use animation but aren't exclusively animations or stop animations.
Yeah.
So there's the Paris group, there's the Czech group. What was the other one you mentioned?
I mentioned Egypt.
Oh, Egypt. Yeah, no, in Egypt, again, that's important because you have the Art and Liberty group in Egypt. And many people don't think of Egypt as a place where surrealism existed. People tend to think of surrealism as a European movement. And so it's very important to realize that there were surrealists in Egypt. There were connections between surrealists in Egypt and other parts of the world, particularly Paris and in England as well, since the colonizing power in Egypt was English. And so there were connections there that were important because surrealism has always been anti-colonial. It's always been a mark of surrealism. In fact, one of the things that the first groups that the Parisian surrealists got involved with of an anti-colonial nature goes back to the Moroccan War, where the Moroccans were fighting for their liberation. And they were supported by the Paris group. And certainly the Parisians were interested in seeing the same kind of thing happen all over the world. And Egypt would be a logical connection there for them to make in that regard. And the Egyptians were very adamant in saying what they were doing was not just a version of what was being done in Europe, but had its own particular trajectory and wanted to have a status that wasn't secondary, that they were interested in confronting the Eurocentrism that did exist to some extent. And they actually had a very positive effect on the international movement by challenging that. So yeah, there's lots of examples of surrealism that has existed throughout the world, really. Yeah. Surrealists from all parts of the world.
You write at some length about the generally troubled relationship between surrealism and the Situationist movement. Can you explain why the Situationists did not look so appealing to the Surrealists?
Yeah, I think it was both, really. There's a lack of appeal on the part of both groups. It was partly because of the Situationist reaction to the Surrealists. Remember, the Surrealists were the older generation. The Situationists, being the younger generation, had to establish their credibility. And there are lots of ways that could be done, but the way they chose to do it was to denigrate surrealism. And so particularly there's a book that was put out under a pseudonym by Magnum, and that book is called A Cavalier History of Surrealism, which is essentially an attack on surrealism, an attempt to discredit it. And to do that, essentially view surrealism as a rival movement. In a way, it's a very Oedipal kind of situation where in order to be who the Situationists wanted to be, they felt they had to look at surrealism as something that was no longer of any value. At the same time that was true, people like Venegas borrowed heavily from the Surrealists in terms of their ideas. People like Guy Debord told Franklin and Penelope Rosamond when they visited with him when they were in France just before Breton died, they visited with Debord and asked him, well, why are you so hostile to surrealism? He said, oh, I've read everything that Andre Breton has ever written. you know, I mean, so they were well versed in surrealism, but they felt the need to attack it in order to establish their prominence. And it was very unfortunate. They probably are a lot more rational, particularly De Boer, than some of the surrealists want to be. The surrealists tend to look at the non-rational side of things, tend to look at automatism and ways that reveal a side of things that aren't purely rational. That could be anti-rational in the sense of challenging rationality, because rationality is usually based on this idea of realism. And realism is something that is a social construct. And so surrealists were attacking the most basic social construct that prevents people from liberating themselves, which is the idea that there is this reality that is unchanging and we must conform to it in some way, that it's something that will always be there, and it's not possible to change it. So I think we see that, if I could sort of digress on that for a moment, I think that that is a very significant kind of situation that we might talk about in terms of today, in terms of what's going on right now in a place like, let's say, the United States or North America. You have a situation where to look at the way in which this thing is reinforced, this idea of reality, and this idea that reality is not subject to change, happens in very subtle ways. One of the ways it happens subtly is through popular culture. So if you've used the phrase, as we all have, I think, or know the phrase if you haven't actually used it yourself, which is a very popular phrase these days, it is what it is. Essentially, if you look at the it, and it is what it is, the it is reality. And in a way, when you say it is what it is, it's a way of saying, well, don't be unrealistic. Don't go outside the bounds of reality. Don't try to think outside those bounds. Accept what it is, as if that is what we have to work with, and we can't really try to subvert it. So if you want to subvert it, though, then you have to really deal not just with big philosophical kinds of issues, but the way in which it's passed on. It's passed on in those ways. Aragorn identified it way back in the early days of surrealism when he wrote Paris Peasant in the 20s. And at that time, he used the phrase, why not make the best of it? Which became a phrase that a lot of people adopted. He used that phrase as a way of demonstrating again how popular culture and the way the colloquial phrases that we use can really restrict our ability to think beyond what's possible and to demand the impossible, which is something anarchists do.
Yeah.
So, when you say something like, just get over it, or suck it up, let's take suck it up. People hear that phrase all the time. That again is a way of saying, suck it up. Reality is all we have, so just deal with it. Don't try to say you're not willing to accept it. Accept it. And this acceptance is something that I've been interested in a book that I wrote called Mutual Acquiescence, because it's the way in which people tell each other that there's no alternative, the way in which people tell each other that we have to accept the as is, the great as is, and not think of the if. And so disallowing any utopian thinking or even any thinking that could challenge the precepts of reality. And I think it's a way, if I think of mutual acquiescence as the polar opposite of mutual aid, which is the anarchist idea that we can come together and subvert essentially the reality that is oppressing us. Mutual acquiescence encourages us to do the opposite, to accept it and get on with things. And so these are very significant ways in which surrealists have tried to address these issues in terms of a revolution of the mind. If you look at the surrealist idea of miserableism, which is a term that was coined by Breton, miserableism is the idea that we get fixed in our heads that misery is the only possible reality. So the system not only creates misery, but the idea that you can't change it, that misery is the only possible reality. And if we kind of examine those and try to figure out how we can move beyond that way of thinking, that becomes an important part of how we change the world. So surrealists were always interested in changing the world and in changing life.
Yeah, and the influence on the imagination and the dream. Yeah. So you should say something about the arrival of surrealism in North America. You've written at great length about the Chicago surrealist group. You should say something now about them, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the Chicago Surrealist group are probably the group that are most prominent in terms of surrealism in North America. But one of the things that saddened me a bit when I did the Surrealist Subversions book was that I didn't get to talk about other surrealist groups and active participants in surrealism throughout North America. But I do want to give Chicago its due here because Penelope and Franklin Rosemont, who were founders of that group, and the other members who participated in that group over the years have been very significant in bringing surrealism to the United States. And they began that with getting involved in a group called Rebel Worker and a publication called Rebel Worker. So they began with a connection with the Wobblies, the industrial workers of the world. And they took that then to also move from that, while never leaving it fully behind, to bring it with them and to bring those ideas with them into a magazine that they ended up publishing called Arsenal. Arsenal Surrealist Subversion was a magazine that was a surrealist magazine, the first significant one in the United States. And they were involved in networking with surrealists all over the world. And, you know, they met with this Paris Surrealist group and they had correspondences with surrealists everywhere. They were involved in a number of different actions within the United States. And I think that it's very important to think that this was during the 60s, during a time of ferment. They were able to bring surrealism into the conversation that was going on then among radicals. And they did that through Radical America, which was an SDS publication, through their own magazine, Arsenal, through the different activities that they were involved in for those years. But there are other groups as well. And of course, in the case of New York, where you're located, there was Up Against the Wall Motherfucker. And that group put out its own publication called Black Mask, was very involved in a number of different actions as surrealists who were not part of an international movement, but who were influenced, deeply influenced by surrealist and Dada ideas that then became incorporated in the way in which they were to become people who challenged in a revolutionary way the reality of the times. In Canada, which is where I'm located at the moment, a very significant group was, one of the first ones was in Montreal. And that was a group that put out a manifesto called Total Refusal. And they were very much challenging the situation in Quebec, which was a very conservative one. Catholic Church was very powerful. And, you know, that group was very important in terms of Canada. where I live now on the West Coast, there's a group called the Inter-Island Surrealist group, which I've been involved in. There are a number of contemporary groups. If we go to the States too, the Peculiar Mormoid group in Atlanta is a contemporary group of surrealists who got started within the last few years. And so it doesn't all go back to the 60s or back to the late 40s in the case of the people who did Refuse Global, the Total Refusal Manifesto. Those are the automatists in Montreal. It's a movement and a series of ideas that have captured the imaginations of lots of different groups and individuals over the years. And I think it's important to sort of note that this isn't a foreign idea that I'm talking about. This is one that's taken root now in the United States. If we think of the Chicago Surrealist group for what, 60 years, 70 years, you know, it's nothing brand new.
You also devote part of a final chapter to influence of surrealism on indigenous movements. Can you talk a little bit about that now?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I've noticed living here in British Columbia, and I'm originally not from here, I'm originally from New York, where you're from. I grew up in Brooklyn, but since I've been here, I've noticed that the indigenous movement is very strong here, is very significant. And it's partly because, and largely because, I live on unceded land. Most of British Columbia is unceded land. And so the anti-colonial struggle is very important here. So there were treaties that were made, but indigenous people, for the most part in British Columbia, never signed a treaty that said, we give you our land. And so that's constantly being challenged. There are constantly blockades. There are constantly court battles that are being fought over that kind of issue. And the Surrealists, as I said, always have this history of anti-colonialism. So it naturally fits. And it's complicated by what a lot of people are concerned with when they talk about Surrealism and indigenous peoples, which is this idea of appropriation, where it's thought it's certainly something that has to be addressed. You don't want to simply appropriate indigenous art. But for Surrealists, a lot of the connection is about what we share in common rather than trying to steal something and take it and make it our own. It's more about a way in which it's possible to see these kinds of deep connections that exist between people that are pursuing similar paths. So Surrealists have always been concerned with myth. They've always been concerned with, well, the reenchantment of the world is something that's a basic goal of Surrealism. And even when they were fighting fascism, I didn't talk much previously when we were talking about fascism, but Breton and Bataille were involved in a group called Counterattack. And Counterattack was very much a group that saw fascism on the rise. And there were street fights between fascists and anti-fascists going on before Paris was finally occupied by the Nazis. Fascism was taking root in France. Situation not too dissimilar from what's going on in the United States right now. And Surrealists were very much involved in those battles, not just as intellectuals, but also as street fighters as well. And so the connection there is a connection about how do you fight fascism? Do you fight it only with rational means, by giving people the correct ideas and pointing out the lies, pointing out rationally how many times Trump has lied and what the lie is? Or do you deal with the fact that there's a whole irrational part of things, a whole part of things that has to do with the unconscious that has to be addressed, that the fascists have been able to colonize and make their own? And that if we really want to fight fascism, we need to address that as well. And surrealism is, since it's concerned with the unconscious and that kind of thing, is very much primed to do that. So with indigenous peoples and the whole idea of indigeneity, which is of course very multifaceted in peoples, not just, there are lots of different approaches within the indigenous world to the way in which, people are coming together and deciding who they are and what their identity will be as a group identity and as individual identities. But given all that, surrealists have been attracted to the essence of that and wanted to make that attraction into something that was a two-way form of communication. And one of the most interesting things lately is that's becoming more the case. There's a group in British Columbia that were a group of indigenous people, indigenous artists, that have been talking about, well, these surrealists seem to have been very interested in our indigenous cultures. Really interesting that they should be interested in us. Why would that be? Let's see what might be there that could interest us about them. And they've put together this project, which is a indigenous project using the idea of exquisite corpse and using it as a way to address issues of colonialism and seeing in ways in which surrealism might be not just something that where the surrealists take ideas from indigenous people and incorporate them into surrealism, but that indigenous people see what the connections might be for them to surrealism. Then it becomes a conversation rather than, it becomes a two-way conversation rather than one group taking from the other. The idea would be to see how they can find a convivial kind of way of finding common ground.
Yeah. Well, Ron, is there a last word you'd like to leave us with?
The last word is that I think a lot of people think surrealism is dead. The death of surrealism has been pronounced many times. And it's very much alive. And so I think one of the problems that we're speaking at an art book gathering today, and one of the problems with many of the art historians who write about surrealism is that they write about it as if it was in the past, as if it's something from the past that might have died at a certain moment in history, let's say after Breton died in 1966. From that time on, surrealism doesn't exist except in the museum. And I think it's very important for me to understand surrealism as a living entity that continues to unfold, continues to grow, has a lot of work undone that surrealism has wanted to accomplish. And surrealism has been around longer since Breton's death than it was before it at this point. So therefore, I think it's important to recognize that and to also look at the anarchist end of this, which is that a lot of the anarchist art historians have done something very similar, in which they've tended to look at surrealism as if it was connected only exclusively to Marxism, and to not see the anarchist content, which is a very big oversight, or to think of it as not very important. And in fact, that anarchist component to surrealism, I think, is the key to understanding surrealism, because it's about demanding the impossible, getting beyond what reality is all about, and not in an escapist way, not trying to simply escape it, but to go deeper, to expand reality, to make reality into something in which people could be living more poetic lives. And that becomes the goal. So for me, for the anarchist, art historians to kind of not examine that is very, very sad. And so one of the reasons I wrote the book was to focus on that, to be able to look at things through an anarchist lens and to look at surrealism through an anarchist lens as a way of combating that idea that surrealism and anarchism really have nothing to do with each other. And they have everything to do with each other.
Great. Well, thanks, Ron. This has been very delightful, and I hope people will find it educational and be drawn to your fuller explications of things in the book.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. It's great always having a conversation with you, and I appreciate being able to be part of this.
Thanks again.
Okay, so we still on here?
Just trying to